two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Jorge DeFendini. He is the chair at this time of the Ithaca Democratic Socialists of America chapter. I am interviewing him today because I heard that he recently attended a statewide meeting of the organization Housing Justice for All. So, Jorge, if there's anything else you need to say about yourself, say it. And if not, simply go into the meeting and who went and what it was about.
I'm Jorge DeFendini, chair for the Ithaca Democratic Socialists of America. I am also a member of the Ithaca Tenants Union, and together, me and a couple of other folks from Ithaca went over to a retreat for Housing Justice for All, which is a coalition of organizations that are working together throughout New York State to advance housing justice through supporting tenant rights, tenant organizing, and things of that regard. So we went to their annual retreat where we reflected on the highs and lows, victories, and shortcomings of this past year and tried to look forward to what we can expect in the future. Namely, how we can build on the big success of passing good cause eviction earlier this year at the state level, and how we can move forward with increasing accessibility and ease with opting into rent stabilization at the state level, and also keeping an eye in the future for other big housing endeavors, specifically green social housing.
Okay, good cause. That's now a state law because I remember it was a big deal. It passed locally, but that's sort of irrelevant now, right?
Right.
I
So
mean, yeah.
when I first got involved in local politics here in Ithaca, there was a big push to try and get good cause eviction passed at the city level. But shortly thereafter, before I could fully settle in to my time on the Common Council, uh, it was ruled by state courts that good cause eviction was not a power that localities could was not a right for localities to pursue in terms of housing protection. So this was something that the state level had to decide on. It was preempted, is the term. And so, unfortunately, that sort of put a damper in what we could do in Ithaca, but that didn't stop us. We continued our organizing and advocacy. During my time on the Common Council, I convinced a majority of Common Councilors to sign a letter calling on the state government to take action since cities and localities were disempowered from passing good cause eviction themselves. And this was a long fight that's gone on for over 5 years now. But earlier this year, in a tough budget fight, predominantly led by our incredible democratic socialists at the state level, including Julia Salazar, the state senator who sponsored the bill, we were able to get a version of good cause eviction passed that allowed cities and municipalities to opt in to good cause eviction. Unfortunately, this bill that was passed was not the full version that was initially introduced. There were a lot of shortcomings with the bill, including, for instance, having to opt in to a good cause as a locality. In other words, your city government or local government has to authorize the passage of this protection for your residents. It's not something that can just automatically take form. And then on top of that, there were a lot of other carve outs in terms of how many units can this apply to. Hello. How many units can this apply to, and things of that regard. So it was definitely a compromise forced by the governor, and her real estate friends. But it has given cities like our own the possibility to opt into the law, which we have.
So that's what that victory in council this spring was. It was an opt-in victory.
That's correct. Ithaca has joined other cities like Kingston, Albany, and I believe Poughkeepsie, if I'm not mistaken. And we are continuing to see more and more cities take the route of opting into good cause eviction.
Okay, so that's at least one thing. Uh, that's about keeping people in their homes when they have homes in the first place. Um, let's see. I had a whole list of possible things, and I'll maybe go through them and ask you one by one. Did was this discussed? I know in many places a problem for keeping, for creating more housing is zoning laws. Was that discussed?
Not so much of a focus was on zoning or on the housing stock question, or in terms of or
Uh-huh.
housing stock. A lot more focus was on efforts for increasing tenant protections and state and rent stabilization.
Okay, I know another issue, and this I know more as from more national discussions, is TOPR, tenant opportunity to purchase.
Yes. So yes, TOPA is a going to be a big priority going forward, especially this upcoming year for folks in the housing movement in New York. The ability to allow tenants an opportunity, the first opportunity to purchase their housing complexes from their landlord, and an opportunity where those units are sold between the landlord and a third party. Usually, this is a big major driving force leading to eviction and housing destabilization for many renters throughout New York. TOPA would create an avenue through which tenants could ensure more stability, and that their homes stay their homes and are not traded like trinkets between landlord and real estate developers.
Okay, so you are referring to it as TOPA,
Right.
TOPA. What does the A stand for?
Pretty sure it stands for ACT, TOPA. So
Oh,
that
okay.
purchase.
Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act. Okay. Now you mentioned rent stabilization as an issue. That is not really the same as rent control. So perhaps you could, but rent control was not under discussion, I take it.
It's not in grave detail, especially not in relation to rent stabilization, as compared to, as you know, the New York has another state law that municipalities are able to opt into, called the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, ETPA.
Hmm.
Law was created in the 70s, and it allows for the creation of a rent guidelines board, an RGB, to help essentially manage and stabilize the rent for buildings of a specific character, namely buildings built in or prior to 1973. And that
For 1974, I was really involved in that a few years ago.
and has a minimum of, I believe, 6 units or more, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Now that, if opted into following a vacancy study, which during one of the last acts I did on the Common Council was securing funding for the city of Ithaca to conduct a study of this variety, which is the first step to opting in. Um, if we are able to do this, a number of buildings, specifically West Village, to name one, could enjoy rent stabilization through ETPA. Uh, Now, the focus in terms of the Housing Justice for All Coalition was talking about how we can ease the process of having cities opt into the legislation, either by reducing the study or even trying to remove the process of opting in altogether and having it sort of blanket as opposed similar to the original intentions of or developments for the good cause eviction bill prior to its watering down by the governor.
Some years ago, I was leading an effort to opt in to ETPA through the priority project of Ithaca DSA that year. And then people said, no, 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 that's much too wonky. It's kind of shut up, you little nerd, is what I got. So, so I'm a little alarmed that it'll go that way. I mean, it's fraught with some dangers.
Sure.
Uh,
Um, I think the complications around or sort of some of the arbitrary elements of ETPA's original sort of development in terms of limiting it to only buildings built in 1974 or prior take a whole lot of potential units that arbitrarily by this law are decided as not being eligible for rent stabilization. And so this is an effort to have New York sort of catch up with the times in terms of really meeting the moment for housing, for the housing crisis that we have, because as time progresses, there are fewer and fewer buildings built in 1974 or prior, and many more tenants who could use the benefit of rent stabilization in their community.
so the aim would be to expand the number of buildings to which this applies. Ah, that's okay. Now, that I think another hazard was that study.
Mhm.
And my fear there comes actually out of some of my related work. There are a lot of consulting firms whose business, the whole way they operate is they have formulas that that build in the assumptions of the capitalists. And so a community or a builder or something goes to them and said, what if we do this? And they say, we will, we will study it scientifically. And they plug the numbers, which might be bigger or smaller, into their formulas. And of course, the result comes out just what the big capitalist developers want.
Through some arcane alchemy. These algorithms and studies developed by capitalists seem to create products or results that definitely benefit them, despite all of us who are renters or advocates for tenant stability living in our reality and being like, this doesn't seem to add up. And I can speak from experience as having formerly been on the council and advocating outside of it that there are countless cities and municipalities of our size that do not have the bandwidth or the capacity to try and take on these efforts, or doing so would be an incredible endeavor. And so the sort of allure of sort of handing this task off to these consultant firms or whatnot to do all of the work in exchange for a couple of tax dollars is very, very lucrative and hard to resist. And so, any ways that we could sort of remove real estate's thumb off of the scale when it comes to doing something like a vacancy study for ETPA would go a long, long way.
Yes, and this actually, some of my experience about this has come about through my more recent work regarding the Industrial Development Agency and the tax abatements that it grants.
Mhm.
And we were just observing, I think, how the Industrial Development Agency, the IDA, engaged a consulting firm that seems to use this kind of formula and came up with some very flawed results about the prospects for a developer's plans to develop Southworks,
Mhm.
um, which actually leads me into another question to you, which is was the damaging role of tax abatements discussed in your meeting?
It actually was not.
Okay.
This is, an issue that we have definitely talked about extensively here in Ithaca since my time in the chapter, and then within the city. There's definitely been a development boom, and there have been definitely folks who correctly assess and acknowledge that we have a housing stock issue. We don't have enough housing units alongside the issue of a lack of tenant protections. But then there are some who believe that if we simply dangle as many carrots and provide as many incentives via a tax abatement for projects, um, we would be able to encourage and attract more of this housing development than we normally would. Now, this is especially difficult for a city like us in Ithaca, where we have a giant enjoyer of tax-free privileges and status, Cornell University, which does not pay property taxes on many, if not most, of its buildings. And so that, combined with a tax abatement policy for developments, can lead an already cash-strapped city to be uh, checking the couches for pennies and spare dimes.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
when
And
it the housing justice for all conversations, though, this was definitely something that the conversation around green social housing is attempting to address, which is trying to move as much of our focus and energy in beefing up the public sector and the state's ability to develop and acquire housing, as opposed to attempting to snake charm the private sector with the right tune into building the units that we need.
yes, that's exactly what I was about to ask you about next. So go, what's the deal with well, g green social housing is the kind of the buzzword for the project, but it's not exactly the name of the bill.
I actually learned at the coalition. I'm just remembering now that we had talked about changing a little bit of the framing here so as to push back against some of the red baiting, fear mongering from the real estate industry. And I believe some of the terms we talked about was sort of housing the future or housing for our future to talk about this. And basically, to begin, many elected officials, including our own Assembly member Anna Kellis, but many of the Democratic Socialists elected to state office, the socialists in office, a couple years ago, went to Vienna, Austria, and had an opportunity to tour their social housing program, and looked at many of their social housing units and met with government officials, with tenants in these social housing programs, And I think they were starstruck, to say the least, because they came back and shortly thereafter, there was talks and soon a bill introduced by Emily Gallagher, another socialist in office in Brooklyn, I believe, introduced that would allow New York State to create a social housing authority that would be empowered and charged with creating and attracting or acquiring housing developments to be run by the Social Housing Authority, the state entity, built and managed and renovated with union jobs, and then collectively managed by a board that would include the union workers who worked on it, the tenants who live in it, and the member and other members of the social housing authority. And the big kicker here is that these would not be market rate or even affordable housing units. These would be units designed to be decommodified housing. The investments or the rent that would be paid would go right back into the building, as opposed to some landlord or uh, a community board's trust fund.
Yeah, and there's more to it. There's a provision also for precisely tenant opportunity to purchase, where tenants of a building that is up for sale uh, would like to form a tenant cooperative. The problem is often, yeah, but they don't have enough capital to buy it. And that would be one of the things that this act could finance,
Right.
such opportunities.
Because as you and I know, the same capitalists who mess around with equations for these vacancy studies in ETPA are also not lining up to fund and provide investments into housing cooperatives for those rabble rousers in the tenant movement.
So it's altogether I looked at the bill and said this is at best a 10-year project. But then I attended a meeting of the supporters. I mean, they put it on Zoom from New York City, New York City DSA. And I think they were talking about trying to pass it in 2027, which seems, I think, a very ambitious plan.
Yes. Aim for the moon so that you could wind up in the stars. I do think, and this was especially clear during the, excuse me, during the Housing Justice for All coalition meetings, that I left a little bit more optimistic about the timeline. I agree that 2027 is a bit more ambitious, but I think there's more in our favor now than there was when the bill was first introduced. For instance, the Socialist in Office program no longer simply consists of socialists in office representing the People's Republic of Astoria in Queens or Speaker Jeffries' backyard in Brooklyn. But now we have socialists in office in, as unthinkable as it may seem, upstate New York with Sarahana Sarisa representing Kingston, Dutchess County, in the Mid Hudson Valley area, an effort led by Mid Hudson Valley DSA, which now joins New York City DSA in their Socialists in Office program. So, as you know, the pathway to victory for most, if not all, state bills in Albany requires buy-in from downstate legislators and upstate legislators. This presents a problem for those of us upstate or those of us downstate working on something where we have most of our energy and resources located in New York City. But now we're starting to open up the battlefield, if you will, with upstate influence, which is going to be really important. On the other hand, building trades have gotten on board with green social housing because, again, most of the renovations and development for these projects will be made with green union jobs. So something that they find very lucrative and towards their interests, and are a very influential group in moving things throughout Albany. So I agree that we are in this for the long haul, but um, I wouldn't count us out too quick in terms of doing this because I think, especially after Housing Justice for All's coalition that I attended, we stressed those of us from Ithaca and from Mid Hudson Valley that if this is going to A, pass, and B, be effective in its implementation, upstate New York must be considered every step of the way in terms of strategy for advancing it and impact, ensuring that all of these incredible, beautiful social housing projects that we build are not just located in Brooklyn and Queens. Wouldn't it be nice to have a social housing development somewhere on the Commons? We'll get there.
Well, I don't think there's space. I mean, interestingly, like the big cities, Ithaca has a lot of problems with land, where you can build. And by the way, one of the problems I think with the Industrial Development Agency approach is that they are eating up the buildable land and even the not very buildable land.
That's right.
Um, we're going to have to, well, if we can greatly reduce the number of cars in this city, then maybe we can put a lot of medium-sized buildings on what are now parking lots.
It's almost as if the climate movement and the housing movement have some interesting and essential intersections.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Very much so. I mean, the other thing is we have to figure out how to use land that is in a floodplain.
Right. And I think all of that highlights the fact that this isn't just called a social housing plan, but a green social housing plan. Because on top of the labor being used to build these and maintain them being green union jobs, the goal is for these buildings to also be carbon neutral. In other words, the emissions that they produce not having the same levels that we're expecting from our buildings that we currently have, because residential and commercial buildings are responsible for a large chunk, if not the largest chunk, of emissions in when it comes to CO2 in our communities. And so combine that with having to reduce car dependency for more buildable land and having a greater, more robust transit system. And you're seeing all these intersections where climate justice and housing justice, it's not a Venn diagram so much as it is a really, really big circle.
Well, thank you, Jorge DeFendini. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 3.